Nice to see everybody back for day 2 of our CTS Bayon Emerging Scholars Symposium. Nice to see familiar faces once again. We're so happy that you are joining us. And just so nobody needs to panic how they're going to make it through the rest of the day, we have some additional food being ordered that'll be here at some point. So for those of you who did not get fed, you will have some food coming your way shortly. So we are very grateful for your participation today and yesterday. Everyone here was here yesterday, right? Was everyone here yesterday? Yeah, very good. Yeah. Very exciting conversation, and we have very limited time, so I'm not going to waste any of it. Today we have Kimberly Redding and Zubair Yusef presenting. Very good. And they will be moderated by Dr. Zachary Moon. So I pass it to you, Dr. Moon.
Again, welcome. May we begin with a moment of prayer. Gracious God, your hands have gathered us in this place. May our time together in the presence of siblings be acceptable in your sight. You perceive all that we carry with us, our weariness and our audacious hopes, our griefs and our dreams. Remind us then that even now, you are making things possible beyond our wildest imaginations. Steady us and open our minds that this time may be an occasion for learning and discovery and connection. Remind us that we belong to each other. Remind us that with you, our longings may be nourished. In all of the names that we know you by, we pray. Amen. It is my privilege to introduce to you 2 wonderful students and scholars who have courageously agreed to bring themselves and their work before us today. Our conversations were already well begun in our time together yesterday. May we continue in that good spirit. Our first presenter today is Zubair Yusef, who is based in Virginia and works in Washington, D.C. as the Chaplaincy Services Coordinator for the Western region of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That work includes recruiting and training new chaplains and offering subject matter expertise on Islam. If you know anything about geography, if he lives in Virginia and works in Washington, D.C., and works for something called the Western region, then he must travel a lot, visiting federal prisons on the West Coast, California, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. Most dear to my heart of these many things about Zubair is he shared with me that he loves soccer. This spoke very meaningfully to my heart. Zubair, my team plays this afternoon. Kickoff is at 5:30. I expect to see you there. Zubair will be presenting today the topic, the Muslim Chaplain, providing leadership to the incarcerated Muslims in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Please join me in welcoming Zubair Yusef.
Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We begin in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dr. Moon, thank you for the introduction. Maybe after everything is done, we will get the time to, my team plays on, I think, Saturday. So see what happens. It's good to be with you and thank you for coming, and those of us who are online as well. I'll be talking about my research, as you've already heard the topic, and I'll just go through basic stuff. And I have about 10 slides to cover, inshallah, God willing. Hopefully, you'll be able to assist me in the guidance, in questions, and then the direction as I go through my research, inshallah. As you can see, I'm going to talk about the role that chaplains play generally, and then specifically and intentionally, I decided to talk about Muslim chaplain. Being Muslim myself, though you all know that when we do chaplaincy, we do it across board, but specifically to the Muslims. And I'm going to explain the reason why, because I see a gap, right? In one of my classes that we learned last year, there is a gap. If there is a gap, you want to fill that gap, right? So which will take me to talking about why is my research important? How am I going to go about it? And what contribution it will make, adding to the existing knowledge. And where there is no existing knowledge, we try and find out through the methodology that we're going to use, inshallah. Next slide. So my thesis objective is to examine the unique challenges and opportunities that are presented to the chaplains in doing their job, in doing their work of ministry. So as you can see, the importance of what? Spiritual leadership. We provide spiritual leadership in terms of guidance, in terms of teaching, and in terms of companionship with the inmates that are incarcerated in the Federal Bureau of Prisons system. And then the second one, of course, is the fact that when I was going through the research that has been done in terms of prison chaplains, especially the role that Muslim chaplains play, I found very, very little material. So hopefully this research will add to whatever is existing, right? To the, the pool of knowledge that we have in that area, which is very, very scant. Next slide. So I intend to use, as you all know, ethnography, which is using my insider knowledge as a chaplain in the system. Of course, when we go deeper, we talk about our own biases. I don't know if there is any research without any bias, because it's a person who conducts the research, right? But we'll try as much as possible to mitigate that. So looking at that, I'll also look at the qualitative and quantitative aspect of it in terms of a survey questionnaire, and then also conduct interviews. My intention is to interview about maybe 22 Muslim imams to get their perspective on what they do and the challenges that they encounter during their work in providing chaplaincy. So ethnography, of course, I already mentioned that my insider knowledge, I'm there, I'm an imam, I'm a chaplain. I have other imams. I think we have about 26 Muslim imams in the entire bureau. And then hopefully I'll be able to interview some of them. And I also have a contingency plan in case I do not get the number of imams that I intend to interview, then we'll improvise as we go along. So qualitatively, I'll use interviews and observations to gather all this information. And then also along the way, I'm going to use whatever literature is there. Now, working for the Bureau of Prisons, we have some rules, regulations, policies, institutional supplements, and some restrictions. There's a lot of restrictions as to what you can do and what you cannot do, where you can go and where you cannot go, but we'll find out and see how we can blend these into coming up with a very, very strong, conclusion at the end of our research. Next slide. What are the roles? What role do we play as chaplains in the system? So one of the roles is pastoral care, then religious instruction, community building, and advocacy. I'm just going to touch on two of them. Pastoral care, when the inmates are sent to prison, right, they lose every single right that they have, except one, which is the freedom of religion. So that is why this is so important, right? And research has proven that when you take care of the religion, it helps them when they come out, not to recidivism, not to go back into the prison and use the prison as a revolving door. So that is why it is so important that we provide this pastoral care. And then I'm going to also touch on the advocacy. What do I mean by advocacy? Advocacy, we try to get them things that they do not have. If I'm going to share something with you, I have been in the Bureau for more than 10 years now, and you won't believe that Muslim inmates, for example, have no access to halal food until 3 years ago. No access to halal food until 3 years ago. They were eating kosher, right? So we started, things were started, and just past 2020, that was when they started experimenting it. And then by 2021, 2022, that is when it went full blown. Even with that, we still experience some shortages, or you have the vendors not having, be able to provide a consistent supply of the food items that Muslim brothers and sisters in the incarcerated environment need in order to practice their faith, right? Next slide. So, as I said earlier on, my research, God willing, inshallah, will contribute to existing knowledge, but there is very, very, very little. So that's one of the objectives that I hope to get. Deepening the understanding of Muslims, chaplaincy in federal system, because a lot of people don't even know. As I go across, I travel a lot. As Dr. Moon said, I do travel to California most of the time, California, Oregon, Nevada, and then also one of my areas that I'm in charge of is Hawaii and Alaska. And then so all of these areas come under my purview. So that means that I need to provide subject matter expertise. And then also, if there is anything that has to do with advocacy in terms of administrative remedies, there's something we call administrative remedies. Remedies are when the inmates put in, what do you call it? We call it in terms of CAPA, when they write something that is against, happening against their religion, so they need an intervention. They need that to be redressed. They need it to be corrected. So that is where I come in. I respond on behalf of the regional director and explain the point of view from the religious perspective. And that helps them to formulate policies that will assist the inmates in guaranteeing and satisfying their First Amendment rights under the Constitution of the United States. Now, the next one is, so in doing this, we have impact, right? Whatever we do in there has an impact on the incarcerated brothers and sisters, all of them, whether Muslims or not. It has an impact in the sense that even seeing the imam, seeing the chaplain walk on the compound, they feel that, wow, I can be somebody like this. Some of them, remember, some of them did not grow up in a what do you call it, two mother, father, or whatever you call both parent homes. Some of them came from broken homes. Some of them never even had passed on from one home to another homes. So when you are there, you are almost like a representative, representing them and then making sure that, God willing, their religious rights are taken into consideration and then they get taken care of. So that is the reason why my research, I believe, is very, very significant. Next slide. So I'm basing my theoretical framework on a writer, on Bruce Biddle. I read a little bit about him. I was doing when I was trying initial stages of my research, I had about, on the advice of my advisor, Dr. Zubair, I had about 6 different research done in prisons. So one thing that kind of caught my attention was the role that you play as a chaplain and how that role not only affects has an impact on the inmate, it has an impact on you as you are in there. So it's almost like, right, that's what happens in that system. So I decided that I'm going to look at it from the perspective of Bruce Biddle. So he's going to underline my theoretical framework. And in addition to that, next slide. In addition to that, I'll look at my leadership in terms of the Quran, my sacred book, and then also from the life and the leadership style of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So I'm combining Bruce Biddle's role theory, and then also I'm combining what is in the Quran in terms of leadership. Leadership is a trust, right? So also I'm going to look at what type of leader was Prophet Muhammad? Was he a transformational leader? Was he what do you call it, change leader, right? Whatever type of leadership that he used in my own context, that is what I'm going to look at and then frame it when I interview the imams that I intend to interview to be able to show what I can do. So role of chaplain Now, to summarize, before I conclude, I need to give you some statistics to show you how important the role of a chaplain is in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Now, we have about 122 institutions nationwide. We have about 160,000 inmates scattered across these 122 institutions. We have about 200 non-Muslim chaplains, right? When I say mostly Protestant chaplains. So when I say Protestant, I'm grouping, I'm putting Catholics in there, and then also, of course, Christians in there. But guess what? Out of this number, we have only, it's only recently, prior to my coming into the system, we had only 16 imams, 16. Now you see why it is important to go into a research like this, to make it known, to let people know that you are needed, right? We are needed into the system. So not only to balance, no, there's nothing to balance here, but also to be able to take care of the needs of our incarcerated brothers and sisters. So in a Catholic priest, we have about 6 Catholic priests in the system, right? And then the Jewish, we have about maybe another same number, 5 or 6, right? But the number of Muslims in our system is 14,000. Now, 14,000 being served by 26 imams. I'm not a mathematician, I don't know math, so I'm sure you can. So if you do math and you tell me what that comes to, right? You can see the shortage, right? And you can see the reason why it is my passion, and I'm very compassionate when I talk about the role that we play and I try to recruit, right? It touches my heart. It's about justice, right? It's about fairness, right? It's about taking care of the minority. It's about taking care of the religion that is, what do you call it? Second or something like that. So it is all that. And I take this very seriously. So that is why I decided to look at my this topic, to be able to encourage people to come into the system. And as they come into the system, we prevent the brothers and sisters when they leave, right? Through our programs, through our teachings, through our directions, we prevent them from going back into the prison. So they call it like revolving door. So we try to reduce the revolving door going back in and out and back and forth, right? So there's the importance in recognizing and supporting Muslim chaplains, the contribution of Muslim chaplains into rehabilitation, justice, and human dignity. Can you imagine somebody cannot eat the food that they want to eat according to their religion? It may sound something small to some people, but it's very, very huge. And remember, when these brothers and sisters are behind bars, man, it's nothing but concrete, steel, wall, right? They don't see anybody unless they are visited. And in some institutions, there's constant fight, there is lockdowns. During the lockdowns, as an imam or as a chaplain, you get the chance to walk around, to walk the block, to go and visit them. I remember during COVID, people were panicking, right? Can you imagine what the inmates were going through, right? So all of this put together is gonna frame my research, and then also kind of look at the human aspect of it, right? So that we make it a point. It's so hard even getting volunteers to come in because some of the prisons themselves are in some remote locations, right? In remote locations, right? So all of these things put together makes the work of a chaplain, especially a Muslim imam, very important to get into the system, right? So future implications, enhancing chaplaincy services and federal prisons. Perhaps this will also go across into the state prisons and also county jails, etc. Inshallah, God willing. So this brings us to the end of my presentation. And then thank you for being here and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Zubair. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for your work. We'll have an opportunity to open this up to conversation, but first we want to hear our second presentation and then we'll have some time for open dialogue. So our second presentation is going to be offered by Kimberly Redding. Kimberly will be joining us here online. So as we're connecting with her, I would like to tell you about Kimberly, that she is a mother and an educator, originally from Pennsylvania. She now lives and works in Wisconsin. Her interest is in local institutions, including urban congregations, as sites of interplay among global, national, local, and individual actors. And this is related in her experience to time she spent teaching English in East Berlin just after the reunification of Germany. And she studies part-time here at CTS. Kimberly will be presenting on the topic, Negotiating Neighborliness in Wartime Congregations. Kimberly, are you with us?
I am. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me? I think I heard a yes. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Your presentation is, you might want to make it full screen for the audience.
All
We can
right.
hear you loud and clear.
Did that work?
No changes on this end.
Changes. I can't make it.
That looks good.
That looks good. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for the introduction. I forgot I had mentioned teaching in East Berlin, but yeah, communities in times of dramatic flux and communities as where sort of the great events of the day intersect with individual people. And this research project is another example of that. So I'll just jump right in and see how we go. So many of us know, I think, that in 1942, the US federal government forcibly removed thousands of Japanese Americans from their homes on the West Coast and transported them to 10 concentration camps, mostly in the West, also in the American South. Some of us know that Protestant missionaries and pastors ministered in these concentration camps. But I think maybe fewer people know that between 1942 and 1945, the federal government resettled, and that's their word, some 30,000 of those incarcerated Japanese Americans to Chicago. These so-called resettlers swelled Chicago's tiny community of Japanese Americans by about 5,000% in 2 years. Some brought Buddhist traditions with them, but many, especially in the first wave, brought and identified as Christian. And in part for this reason, national and city officials enlisted the Chicago Church Federation and its affiliates to welcome the new arrivals. Or rather, again, in the words of the time, to integrate the new arrivals. My first visit to CTS was in March of 2020. And one of the people I met was Yasmin in the Learning Commons. And she told me the archives included a box of materials about these efforts and that somebody ought to look into them. I was immediately intrigued because the subject raised questions to me that are surprisingly modern. Just a couple examples. How did Chicago's white Christians understand the call to welcome the stranger during wartime? How did Protestant parishes engage messy, I think today, or academics would say intersectional, current events? Where is God when faith leaders and academics use the city as laboratory? I'll spill the beans now and tell you I don't have definitive answers to those questions. But asking them and this research helps me consider my own influence, our own influence as civic and community and faith leaders. And this to me is a real strength of CTS. And so I would just today like to give a couple examples of efforts from the 1940s to offer extravagant hospitality in extremely inhospitable cultural contexts. So the context is 1940s Chicago. This was a time when intensely racist wartime patriotism and rapidly changing neighborhood demographics and fears of a rapid influx of Black Americans all together co-informed white Protestant efforts to welcome Japanese American Christians into their neighborhoods. The effort was to be coordinated by Reverend Roy Smith, who quickly became the face of the Chicago Church Federation's official policies. And you see excerpts from a couple quotes from talks he gave and papers he wrote. In 1944, stressing the integration of the Japanese Americans. And then in 1945, stressing his concern that this was a crucial hour in the history of Christianity, and that it was equally crucial to avoid what he considered one more minority race problem. So the official policy sort of captured in these quotes was that the arriving Japanese American Christians should be strongly discouraged from reestablishing Japanese-speaking congregations or even services, both of which they'd had on the West Coast. Instead, the settlers themselves should be parsoned out across urban parishes. And this policy of the Federation aligned very closely with national security concerns. It explicitly aimed to prevent Japanese Americans from congregating, from creating a kind of Asian Bronzeville, if you will. And every urban congregation navigated these expectations differently. So now I have two, maybe if I have time, three examples. So one example, this is probably the most known example. At Fourth Presbyterian Church, parishioners were already bending over backwards, ministering to sailors who were training 1.5 miles away at Navy Pier. Sailors and pilots, actually. The church council was not happy when Reverend Rory Anderson, the senior pastor, suggested offering their chapel to Taiwanese American Reverend H.E. Tsay. Tsay had been leading non-denominational services in both English and Japanese. And in the eyes of at least the most vocal members at Fourth Pres, these newcomers were not integrating. Reverend Anderson, however, pointed out that Fourth Pres had, since its founding, sponsored 4 church starts in various parts of Chicago. And he claimed this as the congregation's calling, as their mission. The bottom photo on the screen shows what would become Chicago's Japanese Church of Christ. In the center front, circled in red, is Reverend Anderson, who was the sole representative of Fourth Presbyterian Church, who participated in the Japanese Americans gatherings in his chapel. How did he defy his congregants and at least some members of his presbytery? Well, it seems he leaned into his institutional mission. He leaned hard. And he used his own public and civic reputation. He used his social capital literally to create space for strangers. To my mind, he embodied what my faith calls me to do. So that's the more known example. Closer to campus is Woodlawn Baptist Church. The church is still there today. On the photo on the side of the screen is a photo I took a couple years ago at Woodlawn. The congregation has changed. The building is still there. And Woodlawn Baptist in the 1940s was also impacted by the arrival of Japanese American Christians to Chicago. The census data on the left shows that Woodlawn was in the midst of a huge demographic transition during World War II. And Woodlawn Baptist was also active in a citywide organization called Interracial Christian Fellowship. And in 1944, Reverend Jitsuo Morikawa spoke at one of the Christian Fellowship's gatherings. He had been ordained into the American Baptist Church in Pasadena, California. He had been incarcerated at Poston Camp in Arizona. And in 1944, he had just been installed as co-pastor at Chicago's First Baptist Church. At the ICF meeting, he spoke directly about discrimination within the mainstream church. Also at this gathering was Woodlawn parishioner and Sunday school teacher, Esther Davis. She responded to Morikawa's talk and calling out an accusation by approaching her own pastor. Would Woodlawn Baptist be willing to host the Interracial Christian Fellowship's annual rally in February of 1945? The pastor said yes, and Davis planned the event. Part of this included going to the offices of the local newspaper, the Woodlawn Booster. And she was going to place ads in the paper inviting members of the community and other parishes to the event. The editor stopped her in the front room. This newspaper does not take positions on 2 issues, liquor and race. Davis thought quickly. She was a member of the community. She was a subscriber to the paper. And she pointed out that the Booster did, in fact, accept advertising from businesses that sold liquor. She got her ads. The second hurdle came, again, from the church council. Many of the members also belonged to at least one civic organization in the neighborhood. The Woodlawn Businessmen's Association considered itself progressive for reasons that I won't go into in the interest of time. And the other organization, the Woodlawn Property Owners Association, took pride in the fact that Woodlawn had protected their neighborhood by being the first in Chicago to adopt restrictive covenants. The deacons of the church, who were also the businessmen and the property owners, called Davis into a very confrontational meeting. They complained that the rally would hurt property values and cited a theological argument to accuse Davis of acting in a non-Christian manner. The meeting notes show that the pastor of the church was in attendance, but sat in the back and said nothing. Davis once again pushed back. Her most effective argument was not theological in nature. Instead, talking to the businessman, the most effective argument proved to be that the ads were already out. The ads were already in the paper. And the upstanding Christians of the church council apparently feared the negative publicity of a retraction. So they offered a compromise. Woodlawn Baptist could host the rally day. However, the deacons would preview and approve all materials used at the gathering. One of the items that they looked at, that Davis submitted to them, was this litany of the brotherhood. And I realize the text is really small and you probably can't see it. Handwritten at the top of this archival copy is a note. It's not clear if the note came from Davis, from the pastor, or someone else. But the note says, censored by the deacons of the church. And you can see on the page the X's marking the dangerous passages. The first dangerous passage says, quote, "It is a first responsibility of the church to demonstrate within its own fellowship the reality of community as God intends it. It is commissioned to call all men into the church, into a divine society that transcends all national and racial limitations and divisions." This is a quote from the Oxford Conference, and the deacons of Woodlawn Baptist at the time did not allow this phrase to be included in the litany. The second passage that they censored is a few lines down. Quote, "For the sin of denying the brotherhood of man in our organized community life, for the discrimination we practice in housing, especially through restrictive covenants, for the unchristian separation of the races in our churches, in our schools, in our hotels, and on our railways, for injustice in employment, we confess our individual and collective sin." Davis held the event, and the deacons of the church censored what could be done there. They couldn't censor the presence of Black and white and brown and Asian and Euro-American and African-American peoples coming in and out of the church on that February afternoon. Sorry, this one, that kind of chokes me up a little bit. So the last example is also not far from CTS. George Nishimoto, who you see there, really young looking to me, you see him there in the upper left, he began teaching Sunday school while in incarceration at Topaz concentration camp in Utah. He was eventually released to attend Eden Seminary. He came to Kenwood, the Kenwood neighborhood, as a ENR pastor. No, let me restate that. He came to the Kenwood neighbor in conjunction with a local ENR church, and he began his ministry focusing on the immediate needs of the community. And that meant that he and his wife Toshi started the Ellis Community Center at 4430 South Ellis. They were supported in this, and I haven't dug into this story quite enough yet, but they were supported by Epiphany Evangelical Lutheran on Bradley Place, so up kind of Lakeview, Ravenwood area. That church was pastored by Reverend Harry Bruckner. The Ellis Center and the Nishimotos provided wraparound care to anyone in the community. And I have just a list of some of their early programs. This was within the first year of opening the Ellis Center. Within a couple years, he had a flock that joined with Kenwood Ellis UCC. And Reverend Nishimoto led a mixed race congregation there as senior pastor until 1961. He networked with both the ENR German churches and the Chicago Resettlers Committee. This was an organization of formerly incarcerated Japanese Americans, mostly pastors, who sought to find common ground and respond to the newcomers' needs over the Church Federation's desire to prevent another race problem by limiting Japanese American agency. The Church Federation, meanwhile, reported already in 1946 that, quote, resettlement, thankfully, I guess, recognized that white clear to me yet if the Federation changed its tactics. It does seem clear that the Federation saw in the War Relocations Authority charge to facilitate integration, the Federation saw in that charge an opportunity to shore up white urban congregations. They didn't seem to think much about the how and the why of blurring civic and Christian duty typical of the time. The same blurring, I would argue, in some ways, that is so contested today. It's just as clear, if you look at the records of the Japanese Americans, that the Federation's efforts were not complete or finished or over in 1946. So the mimeograph sheet shows many of the 20,000 Japanese Americans have not yet found a world where they can feel at home. It feels like a pretty damning conviction of the Federation. It's just as clear, though, and I guess this is leaving on a moment of hope, that individuals then and now defy our institutional mandates and don't let the structures get in the way of acting on our faith. Thanks.
Thanks, Kimberly. So we've got about 12 minutes. I just want to see if there were any questions that were ready to go in the community, because I would love to be able to engage with those questions. Got a mic here in the room and also maybe comments online for our folks there, for either one of our speakers. Please.
Hello, my question is for Imam Zubair. I was wondering how female chaplaincy looks like in the prison systems. Is there a different system, or is it within the same federal system? Is there a need as great as in the male prisons?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, we do not have a single female chaplain, Muslim chaplain in the system. We do not. We need them? Yes, we do, right? They are as important as male chaplains, right? One of my institutions is FCI Dublin in Northern California. I'm sure it's been in the news, and I'm sure you've all seen it. This is public information. It's nothing that I'm revealing from the BOP, right? You know, if you work for a government, sometimes not all the information that you can share, but this is public information. We have a female institution over there, and right now it's shut down, right? Because of some malpractices. So I'm saying all these institutions, and apart from that, we have two female institutions in Florida, and we are in need of female chaplains. Inshallah, we are in need of you. If anybody is interested, you know anybody interested, just reach out and then maybe I'll have some time to discuss the requirements. Bachelor's degree in any field, 120 units up, and then master's degree should be 72 or 73 units above. But the master's has to be master's MDiv in chaplaincy or MDiv in Islamic studies, right? Because if you don't have the number of units, they're not gonna get you in. And then we also need something called endorsement. When you work for the BOP, it's like you are on loan to the federal government from your community. So there has to be an endorsing agency approved by the government that will endorse you, so that will allow you to go and be a chaplain in the federal system. Yes, we need sisters. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you.
I also have a question for the imam. So I'm an imam in California, Orange County. And over there is a organization called Prison Outreach Program. And they presented some of the challenges, such as finding imams to give khutbahs, Friday sermons, in the prisons. So my question to you are, what are some of the challenges in facilitating the needs of the inmates? And how can other organizations like Masajid, mosques, help you in your job?
Thank you. It's very important to have volunteers come in to assist us in doing in ministering to the incarcerated brothers and sisters in the federal prison system. One thing that prevents this from happening regularly is the logistics, right? Some of the prisons, as I said earlier on in my presentation, some of the prisons are located way outside where people live, right? They are in the middle of nowhere. That's a challenge that we have to deal with. And my first posting when I joined the BOP was in Mississippi. We have a prison over there called Yazoo City. It's a complex. So while I was there, almost every month, I would travel around, go around trying to solicit and see if I could get some volunteers to come into the system and help us. It's kind of difficult, and that's the reason why I've also selected this topic to talk about it, so people would know that it is needed. We need people in to come and assist us to minister to. Yes, we do have problems, and one of them is getting volunteers. So in the absence of volunteers, what the Bureau has done is to have contractors, right? Sometimes we have local imam contractors that we sign a contract with them. Since you mentioned California, one of the prisons in California is about 25 miles from Santa Barbara. It's called FCR Lompoc. We have a contracting imam over there who comes in once a month to minister to the incarcerated. I myself, sometimes when I travel, I make sure that my Friday falls on the day that I work, so that I'll be able to do Jummah, to do a khutbah, and then after the khutbah, we sit down and talk. Yeah, so we do have a lot of problems. So that's why we're opening up and trying to hire more people to come into the system.
My comments are for Kimberly. I was extremely interested in your presentation because it really fits in with my own personal family history, if you'll allow me a few minutes to comment. My husband, who is Japanese American, experienced much of the same resettlement issues that you're talking about. They were from the West Coast. They were interned in Minidoka and Idaho. They were resettled. My father-in-law actually was accepted at Earlham College, a Quaker school in Indiana, because it was one of the few places that was taking Japanese Americans during the war, and they ultimately resettled in Chicago. Interestingly, they settled in the Douglas Park neighborhood, and they were welcomed because it was a neighborhood of racial change, and I think they were seen as a buffer between the whites who were moving out and blacks who were moving in. They ultimately moved to Uptown. And of course, I mean, I didn't know him in 1946, but the family, but my grandmother-in-law, his grandmother, was part of a mixed church, a Ravenswood community church that was the same thing you're talking about, an existing white congregation that embraced a Japanese congregation as with, the individual ministers and individual services. And I just never had any idea that this was part of a whole, effort. And then ironically, when, as I told my table mates, my husband eventually got a degree here from CTS, finished in the 80s, and his chaplaincy was for the Chicago Church Federation, which I find is great irony. So I don't have an exact question, but I appreciate your research, and I would love to be able to follow up with you on what other information you find. Thank you.
Absolutely. Do you have any Church Federation records buried in a closet at home somewhere?
Well, I'll tell you, no. The only thing we did was one of his assignments here was to do a project for them on hunger, and it was a TV spot for them. And for some reason, he used my hands because they're kind of bony and veiny, and my hands were in the picture as looking like a person that was experiencing hunger in his commercial. But other than that, no.
There's another wing of this project that I would be kind of really interested in following up on, which is the University of Chicago Sociology Department, so the Chicago School of Sociology, basically, and CTS partnered and sent students, graduate students mostly, into particularly Japanese American Buddhist congregations in the area to do sort of ethnographic sociological studies. And so, if I remember correctly, part of this is what Yasmin has in the archives. I'd have to double check my notes, which archives I saw this in. But pretty fascinating watching these mostly pretty young graduate students getting ready to go into ministry, sort of practicing their observational skills in a community of practice about which they know next to nothing. And I could imagine like a whole class kind of based on that. Because one of the reasons I love history is it is a nice sideways way to engage our own selves, right? And our own communities. Because sometimes it's easier to think a little bit about people back then in that particular context, and then come around to us and our congregations and our faith communities or our civic organizations, and who are we serving when we say we're serving. Thank you, though. Thank you for the comment. That's great. I have another name to watch for now.
All right, it looks like we have two more questions, one in the room, and then Rachel Mikva, we see you as well.
Let's start with Dr. Mikva.
Okay, Dr. Mikva, you're up first.
Well, this is a follow-up really for Kimberly. I'm wondering to what extent you have looked into and what you might be able to share about how this history shapes the current religious demographic landscape of Chicago.
So it's sort of a typical Chicago migrant story in the sense that so this was a time in the 1940s when a number of the urban white Protestant, particularly congregations, were sort of on the edge thinking about moving out into the early suburbs, right? And this, of course, picked up in the 1950s and especially the 60s. So one of the reasons for partnering with the Japanese American pastors was to sort of shore up that congregation in the home neighborhood and see if they could make a go of it. Over time, what tended to happen was that the white Protestant congregations, some of them stayed, many of them sort of changed hands or shifted from, there was one that shifted from Lutheran to United Church of Christ and kind of stayed. And some of the, I don't really know how to say this, but the sort of successful Japanese American congregations also moved. In sort of the same pattern that other migrant communities moved in Chicago. And so Woodlawn Baptist, for example, was at the time a majority white congregation and is now Black and African American, still as a Baptist church.
Thanks, Kimberly. We've just got time for this one last question, please.
My question is for Imam Zubair about your research methods. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I was wondering what the rationale is for interviewing imams in the federal prison system and not Muslim inmates.
Thank you so much for this question. And it is intentional. And the reason being that while I was doing research in other research that have been done in that area, one of the papers I read said it took him 6 to 7 months to get answers when they requested to interview inmates. And you can imagine, I work in that system. And in the end, when the answers came, they were not even approved. Yeah, so I'm trying to be very strategic here. I gotta get my demon right. So I don't want anything to hold me back. So I'm gonna focus on where I can get the information, and then later on, we can take care of the, the rest, especially when you get that pedigree, you can talk, now you can write. And when I put in for a request, it can take as long as it wants to take. I'll be patient, but this is school. I gotta finish the school. So that's purely, it's one of the criticism that I may have on my research paper, and I'm gonna point it out, and I'm gonna show the reason why I couldn't do that. Otherwise, yes, it will make sense to know the impact that your research or your programs are having on the inmate population. But the prison is a different environment. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming, or thanking, I should say, these wonderful speakers.
So I think we've filled up this very limited time just as much as we can. So please be released to the rest of your days. Thank you again for your presence and your engagement this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
I'm a brand new entered student, and one of the areas I'm interested in is